Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, helping transform crowded, dated, or inefficient kitchens into more functional spaces for daily life. Details at callmosby.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio, this is St. Louis on the Air. I'm Alex Hoyer. A simple telling of the Lewis and Clark expedition goes like this. Explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out from just north of St. Louis in 1804 to explore the Missouri River. They traveled with about 36 people and were told to map out a new territory for the Americans, establish diplomatic and trading ties with native nations, and hopefully find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Along the way, they were helped by a native woman named Sacagawea. When they returned to St. Louis in 1806, they'd traveled about 8,000 miles. That's all true, but the story is much deeper and more complicated than that. Historian Craig Fehrman is the author of a new history of the expedition titled This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. And he's in St. Louis for an author event that's tomorrow night at St. Louis County Library's Clark Family Branch, and he's here in studio with me now. Welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hey, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So set the stage for us about the Lewis and Clark expedition. This really stems from President Thomas Jefferson, and he is really interested in an expedition that would map out the Missouri River and go west. Why?
Well, he's been interested in this for decades. He was interested so early on that first he asked William Clark's older brother, George Rogers Clark, who politely declined. But the reason Jefferson was obsessed with this for decades is because, first of all, he wanted that water route to facilitate trade. But it's important to understand in terms of this time period that trade was always about more than that. So Jefferson wanted to figure out how could traders meet with native people and speed up American commerce. But he also wanted to map this area, which would help America's future imperial claims. And he also wanted to make scientific discoveries, which would help America's future imperial claims. So it makes sense. Jefferson's such a polymath as a human being. If he's interested in one thing, he's interested in all things. But the expedition was exactly like that, too. Jefferson was looking for that water route, but that water route had so many implications. And that's one reason it's such a fascinating story.
It is an expensive proposition to do this. Was it an easy sell in the United States?
Most people think that it was, but one of the new things I found with my book is that it was not at all. It's funny, when you're a historian, sometimes it's hard to convey to people what the past was like. But in terms of Washington, D.C., it was actually pretty easy because there were two sides and they hated each other. And if one side said, hey, here's our new idea, the other idea said, we don't like that idea. We don't even need to hear anything about it. We just don't like it.
And this would have been the Democratic Republicans and then the Federalists on the other side.
That's exactly right. And so Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, and he brought up this idea, but the Federalists were opposed to it. Today Lewis and Clark feels kind of all-American with a really high approval rating. But back then, there were plenty of people who opposed it. And so I went back in the letters. Jefferson didn't leave a lot of letters about how he was able to get the expedition funded, but his colleagues did. So I went through all these archives for senators and representatives who were there and sort of pieced together how Jefferson was able to kind of strong-arm the expedition through and get it approved. It involved fancy dinners at the White House where Meriwether Lewis was right there helping kind of wine and dine people, and then just, good old-fashioned political persuasion.
The Louisiana Purchase comes into play here, and it's often framed as a $15 million deal that doubled the size of the United States. But it's more complicated than that. Tell us about preemption rights.
Sure. So yeah, the idea that you hear in school that the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of America, that's just not true. And we know this because of really careful work by lots of academic historians that has happened only in the last 5 or 10 years. But what the Louisiana Purchase conveyed for all that land was the preemption rights. And preemption rights just means that, there are different empires sort of eyeing the middle of this continent. But whichever empire controls the preemption rights, that doesn't mean they own the land, but it means they own the right to buy the land in the future. Because in 1804, when the expedition first takes off, native people hold the power. The native towns along the Missouri are much bigger than St. Louis. The native armies that are available to native leaders are much more powerful than an American army or a Spanish army or anything like that. So preemption rights was sort of like a put this land in a holding pattern where somebody else would be able to purchase it hypothetically in the future. When America did the Louisiana Purchase, that meant that they sort of became the point person. They were the ones who could negotiate and do trades with the native people. And if the native people wanted to sell the land, the Americans would be the ones that they dealt with. But the total cost ended up being not that $15 million figure we all know from school. It ended up costing more than $400 million once all the treaties were done. And Interestingly, a lot of those treaties were done by William Clark from St. Louis in the decades after the expedition.
And explain, St. Louis is a town that was settled by the French, but the Spanish were also involved. The Louisiana Purchase was from France, but explain what France and Spain are doing around this time when when the Corps of Discovery sets off.
Sure. So this is another reason why Jefferson had a hard time getting the bill passed, because this was a very tumultuous time where America was still a new country. It was not yet a powerful empire, even though Jefferson definitely had those ambitions. So there was Spanish control, but there were rumors that the French were going to take over. Those rumors became more and more clear, but the Spanish officials were still the ones in charge in St. Louis and in New Orleans. So Lewis and Clark had to worry about being stopped by either nation. They had to worry about British traders further to the north. There were all these different nations in play. And then, of course, the native nations as well, who were very smart at playing, the Spanish off the French or the French off the British. It was a geopolitical situation that was very up in the air and exciting, but I think also kind of unnerving for Lewis and Clark heading into it.
And we're going to talk much more later in the show about the native nations that they encountered along the way. Your book is organized in a way that each chapter is devoted to a single character. Some people only get one chapter, but there are others who get more. Two people who get more than one are Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. And it was Lewis who did much of the planning. And you mentioned just a moment ago that he was involved in wining and dining at the White House. But introduce us more broadly to Meriwether Lewis.
Sure. So Lewis was somebody who grew up in Virginia, and his father died when he was young. And so he had to sort of take over the family plantation. And I think there were parts of it that he enjoyed. Lewis is somebody that even from childhood, there are stories of him being outside, exploring through Virginia, learning the names of plants and animals. He was somebody who the outdoors just agreed with him. But there were parts of that life that did not agree with him. So he joined the Army, and he just kind of fell for it. The letters that he would write to his mother while he was in the Army are just, you can just tell it's somebody who's sort of finding their purpose and finding, their patriotism. Lewis was somebody who loved America and loved the military and really believed in the same ideals that Jefferson did. So once Jefferson became president, he had to pick, advisors and aides. And Lewis was a smart choice for him because they were both Democratic Republicans and they could trust each other. And they had also grown up in the same part of Virginia. So Lewis became Jefferson's private secretary. But I think the term I would use if we were thinking about it in today's terms is his chief of staff. He was a really important person. He was a liaison between the White House and the Capitol building. So Lewis had military experience. He had political experience. He had this kind of amateur experience in terms of the outdoors and observation. And Jefferson, I think, correctly saw this is the person who brings all these skills together. This is the right person to lead this incredible mission.
So what happens when Jefferson says, okay, this mission is a go? What does Lewis do?
Lewis is excited, but I think when you look at how much preparation he was doing, he was preparing to be careful, but I think it was kind of an overwhelming thing. A detail I always think of is this iron frame boat that Lewis designed. And so it's sort of the Enlightenment equivalent of a birch bark canoe. It's an iron frame that can be covered with animal skins, and it's supposed to only take a week to do at Harper's Ferry, which at that time was sort of the big factory that the federal government used to make weapons and things like that. But Lewis ends up spending a month in Harper's Ferry, and these are important weeks he's frittering away because, the river levels are going down. They've got to get started. But I think Lewis knew how much uncertainty was ahead of him. He knew how many different bad things could happen. And he was somebody who just, when faced with that kind of fear and that kind of challenge, he liked to control it. So he's like, I'm going to make this canoe that will save me if I need it. I'm going to personally test out the rifles the government artisans have made for me so I can make sure that they're going to work. He was somebody who did this preparation because it was the smart and strategic thing to do, but I think it also kind of calmed him a little bit because he knew that this was a huge challenge.
In the book, you write about the boat builder. Tell us about him.
Oh my gosh. He was, there were things that Lewis could not control, and the person who was building their big barge definitely falls in that category. At this point, they're in Pittsburgh, and so Lewis wants a big barge, and I do mean big. It's the size of a semi-truck trailer today. So this is going to hold a lot of their cargo. This is going to be their main craft as they ascend the Missouri. But the boat builder was a drunk, And so he would get in fights with his men. He would run some of the men off. Some of the men were drunk, so they couldn't get enough lumber. And so Lewis had already created these delays by trying to control everything. And then this boat builder is something he can't control, who creates more delays. And this just makes they were supposed to leave in early 1803, and just the months keep stacking up. The letters from Jefferson saying, like, it's really time to get moving, keep adding up. Even before the expedition starts, the pressure is so high.
Yeah, and of course they get the boat down the Ohio River. And this is also around the time, or perhaps a little bit before that, William Clark gets involved. So how does Clark get in on this expedition?
Sure. So Lewis and Clark were friends when they were in the Army. They were both young Army officers together in what is now Ohio. So they had this relationship, and they just trusted each other. You can tell in their letters when Clark wrote to Lewis and said, I want to join with you on this. And to Lewis's invitation, Clark said that he would join with hand and heart. And I love that phrase, and that phrase captures, I think, the trust and the confidence and the kind of companionship that these two men felt together. And it's really interesting that there's two of them because, if you talk to even soldiers today, in a tense situation, you don't want to compromise chain of command. You want, when a decision has to happen within seconds and everything's riding on it, you want to know that there's one person to look to. But Lewis and Clark intentionally set things up so there would be two, which is a very unusual approach. But history proved that they made a right choice, and I think it worked because they had that close friendship.
And that's exactly where I was going to go with this, because during the expedition, there would be times when they would have to split up. One would go explore some other waterway, or one of the captains would be on the land. And you also write in the book, you use the phrase the experiment several times. And I'm particularly interested in chain of command and what the experiment meant in terms of military discipline.
Sure. So this is another thing that's pretty new in the book, and I was able to figure this out not by studying Lewis and Clark, but by studying what normal military units were like in this time. So I went to the National Archives and went through a lot of letters, and I read a lot of the great scholarship on what a normal military unit was like. And let me give you an example from somebody named John Ordway, who would ultimately join the expedition. He's also one of the people who gets chapters from his point of view. But I found out his captain was a guy named Cornelius Lyman. And so Lyman, at one point, he had his company somewhere in New England, and a merchant came up and said, I think some of your soldiers have stolen some of our stuff. And Lyman didn't ask the soldiers for their opinion. He just grabbed a cat o' nine tails and started beating one of the men until the man confessed. And that's an honest and accurate representation of what the Army was like in this time period. A lot of the soldiers came from very tough backgrounds. A lot of the officers were elites who really wanted a strict boundary between the officers and the enlisted men. So it was very violent, and it was very rigid. Lewis and Clark organized their unit, though, in a totally different way, and that's why I call it the experiment, also kind of a nod to the Enlightenment ideas that are so important in this time period. It started with Lewis and Clark sort of sharing command, but it extended beyond that. Once you understand how most Army units work in this time period, the fact that Lewis and Clark constantly polled their men and asked for their advice, let them vote on key turning points, you can see that Lewis and Clark really tried to empower the men. And I think they probably did this for personal reasons. I think they were happy to have the unit work this way, but there was also a real strategy to it, because the more the men are invested in the expedition, the more the men will care when times get really tough, but also the quicker the men can react. You mentioned sometimes the party would have to split up. And so there were times when, there wasn't an opportunity for Lewis and Clark to lay out a strategy. Sometimes the men just had to make a split-second decision. Lewis and Clark, from the very beginning here in St. Louis, where they were sort of kind of putting some of the non-soldiers through boot camp and getting everybody on the same page, they empowered those men, and the men repaid that trust in the years to come.
I mentioned earlier on that there were some 33 people on the Corps of Discovery. Why did people want to do this? Because it seemed like a thing that a lot of soldiers and civilians wanted to do.
Yeah. I found a letter from one of the granddaughters of one of the soldiers, and she talked about this place, Fort Kaskaskia, which is pretty close to here. And more than 100 soldiers tried out for just a few spots. So there was a huge desire to do this. And the reason, I think, was it was just a chance to do something big. We've all just lived through Artemis II and how excited the whole country was, and seeing these representatives of our nation go do something big. And the Lewis and Clark expedition was seen in the exact same way at this time period. Like I said, it was partisan. There were two different sides. But once Jefferson got it funded, once the headlines were about this big expedition, regular Americans got really excited, and so soldiers were thrilled to do it. John Ordway, who I've already mentioned, I love the guy, so I'm going to bring him up a lot.
Well, and you mentioned that he was the only person to write in a journal every single day of the expedition, so I imagine what he wrote was extremely valuable to you.
And to get that working class point of view, too, because Lewis and Clark often, Clark was working on his maps, Lewis was working on his science. John Ordway was the guy in the cold river doing the real hard work every day. But in a letter to his parents before he left, Ordway talks with such joy about joining this expedition, and he doesn't even have to define it or anything. He just says, I'm joining the expedition with Lewis and Clark. His parents knew. I went back and read the New Hampshire newspapers that his parents would have read. By this point, they knew exactly what was happening. And Ordway talks about, I have a chance to make great discoveries. That's his phrase. So you can see why these regular soldiers were just thrilled to have a mission with real purpose and a chance to do something great for themselves and for their country.
Because it was also something that I believe extended his military service.
That's right. Ordway was near the end of his 5-year enlistment, and his letters make it clear that he was not having a great time in the Army. So you can imagine him at Fort Kaskaskia just kind of counting down the days till he can get out of the Army, get his paycheck, go back to New Hampshire, and then Lewis and Clark show up in this giant barge, and they start talking about this thing people have been able to read about in newspapers. Of course he's going to try out, and he was thrilled to be chosen, and the captains were thrilled to choose him because he was one of the most important people on the expedition.
Well, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the start of that expedition from just north of St. Louis up the Missouri River. But before I take that break, I want to invite you to the conversation. Do you have a question about the Lewis and Clark expedition? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. We'll be back shortly to continue this conversation with Craig Fehrman, the author of the book This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
Welcome back. I'm Alex Hoyer. I'm talking this hour with historian Craig Fehrman, the author of the new book, This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. He'll be talking about the book tomorrow night at 7 at an author event at St. Louis County Library's Clark Family Branch. I mentioned before the break that when we came back, we'd talk about the start of the expedition, when they actually start to go up the Missouri River. This is in 1804. Tell us about the start.
Well, it was a slow start. They had a lot to learn. It started with that barge, and especially with the Missouri current, which was faster than the Mississippi or the Ohio, and with the Missouri, they were having to go against that current. So at the beginning, I feel like the thing they had to learn was just the simple act of movement, because they had a mast, they had sails, but often the wind wouldn't cooperate. So they tried rowing, they tried poling, where they would have these long poles with metal tips that they would sort of sink into the bottom and push and walk. But sometimes they had to tow. Sometimes they had to tie a rope to that mast and then get in the water and just pull as much as they could. The boat would spin in the current. There were tree trunks sort of lodged in place by the mud and the silt that are always, dissolving into that river. But they got better. They adapted. They persevered. And so each day they would work, and, it was 5 or 10 miles a day at first, but then it got more to 10 or 20, and they just kept making progress one day at a time.
And it was 33 men. You said earlier that their barge was about the size of a semi-truck. Mm-hmm. What other boats were involved? Paint a picture of what it would have looked like, how many vessels going along the river.
Sure. So it changed a lot. But at this point here, when we're sort of leaving St. Louis at the start, there was the big barge, and that's where the 33 men, the sort of what was called the permanent party, the regular soldiers were. And then there were 2 more boats called pirogues. One was sort of a white tent, one had sort of a reddish tent. And in one was some soldiers who were always going to sort of leave early on and come back to St. Louis. And then there were some hired French hands who had a real familiarity with the fur trade we've been talking about and were there to offer advice. So you had these 2 small smaller boats, you had the big barge, and sometimes they would work in a line, sometimes they would sort of split up a little bit as they're trying to find eddies and cross currents. But the main thing was just make progress as easily as they could. It just never was very easy.
What would the impression of those who they encountered, particularly Native people, what do you think they would have thought when they saw this? Because there had been fur traders who would go along, but this was a serious expedition.
Sure, and we don't have to guess here. We can know because some native oral traditions have preserved these early reactions. So normally, let's use the Lakota as an example. Lakota scouts would sort of spot this early on and observe, and then take that information back to Lakota leaders. And this was the biggest party of white people that they had ever seen. There had been other ones that would leave St. Louis, but there would be 5 or 10 people, maybe 20 or 30. Here you have more than 40 people, including the kind of helpers, heavily armed, not really interested in trading, interested in meeting and talking about politics and diplomacy, but not looking to trade this for that. So this was something unusual, and Native people spotted it, held their own councils, and then decided, how can we use this for our advantage? It wasn't just that Native people were scared or surprised. They were very strategic actors who realized, this is something new, but this is something we can work with too.
I want to take a call. We have Robert calling from Chesterfield. Robert, you're on St. Louis on the Air. Go ahead.
Hi. Can you talk more about how these guys propelled their crafts up the Missouri River? I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, given that, back then the Missouri was not channelized. It's springtime-ish, summer. There's all sorts of stuff floating down the river. I mean, literally full trees. The river is very shallow, and they don't have any kind of motorized equipment. And their craft is really, really heavy. All their gear back then is, wood and steel, and they're carrying a ton of weight.
Yeah, that's a great question, Robert. Thank you. Craig?
Yeah, the only answer is slowly. There was a reason. Jefferson's first idea, he said maybe 10 or 12 men can do this. But Lewis and then Clark, once they met up in Louisville, they quickly realized we need more men than this, and we need those men for manpower. And so the barge could have 20 or 22 people rowing. So sometimes they would do that. But often it was the poling I talked to, and that's a hard thing to describe. I remember when I was writing this book, I read all the descriptions of poling, and they just weren't quite clicking for me. So I would just kind of I took a broomstick and just kind of stood in a laundry basket in my living room and was like, well, okay, they plant the pole here, they push here, they walk this way. But it was a very effective thing. Clark, in the winter where they were outside St. Louis, added these sort of cabinets to the side of the barge. And so on them were sort of footholds. So the men would stab a pole into the bottom, and there would be 10 men on each side, let's say, stabbing a pole down. And then they would just lean into the pole and walk. And their steps would sort of propel the boat in the opposite direction. It was kind of ungainly, but it was effective. They would do that. And towing was really important too. The other thing, and Robert really nailed this talking about the conditions of the river, sometimes you would have a log jam or a tree floating through you. It would knock the barge a little bit off course, but then the current really starts working against you because it makes the barge want to spin. So the word Clark would always use for this is wheeling. I think you can kind of see his military background there because he's thinking about, soldiers and formations and wheeling. So they would see the barge start to wheel, and people would just have to jump in the water with a rope and try to tow it back on course. It was really, really difficult to do this, but they also got better. I mean, the wheeling became less and less frequent. They were able to make more and more good time, but they never made great time. It was just every day they woke up and the challenge was the same: make as many miles as we can.
I mentioned earlier that your book is organized in a way that has chapters devoted to characters. So I want some of our conversation to be devoted to other characters. We've talked about Lewis, we've talked about Clark, and I want to talk now about York, who has more than one chapter. He is a black man who was enslaved by William Clark. Tell us about York.
Well, York was on every mile of the expedition. And we're talking about moving the barge. He was an essential part of that. One of the things that's preserved in Clark's comments about York is that York was a large and strong person. We also know that York was a great swimmer, which this is one of the things that surprised me most about working on this book. But being a good swimmer was not something you could take for granted in this time. So there were, even with all the people who wanted to try out, even with the competition to be on the expedition, there were still a lot of men on it who could not swim. York could. And so the fact that he was big and strong and a good swimmer made him essential to moving the boat. But he also did other things that were really important. Soon after leaving St. Louis, he was able to carry a rifle. And so he was the 5th named person in the journals to bring down a buffalo. He was really interesting to the native people. A lot of the native people had seen white traders before, but they had never seen somebody with black skin. So
talk more about that and just what York would do when he came across native people.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The native people would sort of come up to him. Some of them would really get in his personal space. They would spit on him and sort of try to rub the spit to see if they could rub the paint off, not realizing that color was just the natural color of his skin. And one thing that I think is so interesting, and it's a point I tried to make again and again in the book, is that Clark didn't always like this. When we think about the psychology of a slave owner and an enslaved person, Clark wanted to be in control. And when York started doing things that got him attention that weren't necessarily Clark's ideas, that bothered Clark in a way that's not always easy to understand or explain today. And we know this from Clark's journals. So Clark actually told York, even though York was getting all this attention from native people, and even though it was really helping the expedition because it was, bringing lots of people to meet them and the people were peaceful and excited, Clark told York to knock it off. But what's so interesting is that York didn't. York kept doing this. And I think that's because the further they got west and the further they got from American society, York realized, I've become an important part of this expedition and I can make some choices out here. I can do some things I want to do. And one of the things he wanted to do was interact with the native people, and the native people loved it.
And another example of that, in one of the early chapters of about York, you write about a ball that was held in St. Louis. This is before the Corps of Discovery began, and how as a servant to William Clark, he would have been dressed nicely, but he would have had to stay in the background, not participate in any of the dancing. But then in a later chapter, you talk about when they're on their trip, that they would bring out a fiddle and that York would have been dancing.
That's right.
And so I think it demonstrates that things changed the further you got out west. He was still enslaved, but things changed.
Absolutely. Yeah, there were laws in St. Louis at this time that a black person dancing in that situation could be beaten for it. So there was no way he could have danced at that ball. But once they're at Fort Mandan in what's now North Dakota, and the fiddle comes out and the fire is flickering, York can dance, and he does dance. He loved to dance. We know that from several mentions about his life. And I think the dancing or the interacting with native people, carrying a rifle, these all show ways that York was able to sort of make some choices, create some room for himself. And Clark didn't always like it, but Clark did allow it to happen. And York slowly earned the trust and then more than trust, the respect of a lot of the men on this expedition.
I want to turn us now to talking about the native people that they encountered. But before we get to that, I want to take another caller. This is Chris in Chesterfield. Chris, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to comment. I have a 2-book set that are copies of Lewis and Clark's journals. And the characters, the individual stories are just very interesting. One that sticks out to me is when they were in the Nebraska, South Dakota area in the middle of winter, 2 of the men out on a scouting party, out overnight in sub-zero temperatures, didn't have supplies and stuff for that night. They come back the next morning, they comment a little frostbite, but no worse for the wear. They're all good. Just how tough these guys and committed they were, as you commented, just astounding. I mean, just great stories in reading these individual accounts. But I really enjoy the topic you're covering.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm curious, how did you acquire those writings of Lewis and Clark? What motivated you?
So I got them from my father. We were on a vacation in Hawaii one time, and these books were at the condo we were staying at. He loved them. We found copies of them and bought them for him, and then he left them to us.
Thanks for the call, Chris. What's your reaction to that, Craig?
My reaction is that I love this story, and this is one of the reasons I was so excited to write this book. This is one of the reasons I was a little scared to write this book, because this story means so much to so many American people, whether it's somebody who learned about Sacagawea in grade school, or somebody who took a family trip, or somebody who's read the journals like the caller there. There are so many Americans who have a connection to the story, especially here in St. Louis. And I love that. It's one of those history stories that feels alive to all of us, and I was excited to sort of write about a big all-American story. It was important to me that I could find something new to say, and I think I did. But, there's a reason people love Lewis and Clark and why the expedition is so important. It's an amazing story of perseverance, and whether it was the cold nights like the caller described or the river that we've been talking about, they had so many obstacles to overcome.
Thanks again to Chris in Chesterfield. We have some open phone lines, so you can ask your questions about Lewis and Clark, too. You can give us a call at 314-382-8255. Again, that's 314-382-TALK. I promised that we'd talk about the native people that they encountered. It's a huge part of the book, and we had a comment from Michael from Ladue who called in to say that he'd love to hear more about the Native American tribes that Lewis and Clark encountered along their expedition. Part of the mission was diplomacy with Native nations and trade. Give us kind of an entry into what that early communication was like among the people who already lived in this land.
Sure. So because of the Louisiana Purchase, one of the things that they would do when they would have these councils, and they had more than a dozen of these councils, they met with more than 50 Native nations along this route. They were not going into empty territory. They were not going to where nobody knew what was next. They might not always know what was next, but this was a densely populated area with a big history that predated them. And so at these councils, they would sort of say, the Louisiana Purchase has happened. We, the Americans, are now kind of your point people for trade and for commerce. They would pass out different gifts like American flags or these coins with a picture of Jefferson's face on it. That would be sort of a symbol of the new relationship. And they would explain Jefferson's policy, which was basically free trade. The phrase they used was the Missouri should be an open road, as open as a river with all the obstacles we've talked about can actually be. But that was the idea. And so Jefferson's goal was peace through commerce. And so Native nations should not fight with other Native nations. Native nations should not attack traders. Everybody should just have free trade and a lot of trade. And if they did this was the easiest route towards the Americans building trading posts and more prosperity for everybody. Of course, this was also the easiest route towards American expansion, which was part of Jefferson's goal as well.
And Jefferson also wanted Lewis and Clark to send Native people back to Washington, D.C., and that happened fairly early on.
Yeah, that's right. That's, again, St. Louis plays a starring role here because there were some Osage leaders that were part of the first delegation to head all the way back east. These delegations, I think, are so important, and they barely show up in other accounts of the expedition. But to me, they feel like Lewis and Clark in reverse. And Jefferson, to his credit, saw them this way too. When Native people would make this travel, and whether it's from St. Louis all the way to Washington, D.C., or some of the people would come from South Dakota or North Dakota, those areas today, that far up the Missouri, all the way to Washington, D.C., and Jefferson would say to them at the White House, thanks for coming. We're exploring your country. We want you to explore our country too. So it's such a fascinating example, I think, of Jefferson's policy, but also just of the human beings. And we can know a lot about what Native people did on these visits because some of their songs were preserved. Newspapers were reporting on this in real time. And one person I devote a chapter to is a gentleman named Biahito, who was an Arikara leader. He made this fascinating map that disappeared for a long time until a scholar found a copy of it in France. And I reproduced the map in my books. The front end papers of my book is Clark's famous map. The back end papers is Biahito's map. Both of these are maps of the Missouri, but you can kind of see that to get the full understanding, you need to see the Missouri from both points of view.
Two Native people who you write about, well, I should say that the interactions with Native people go relatively well early on, but then you write about Black Buffalo and the Partisan. They were both leaders of the Lakota, but they were rivals. Where do Lewis and Clark first encounter them?
Well, they encounter them in up the Missouri, past what's called the Big Bend of the Missouri. And so according to Lakota traditions, the scouts had already been sort of monitoring like we were talking about. And then they reached out. Lewis and Clark said, let's have one of these councils. And they expected the council with the Lakota to be another kind of quick, let's share Jefferson's message, let's share some gifts, and let's go on. But the Lakota in this time period were extremely powerful. Traders at the time said that, this is the nation that actually controls the Missouri. And Jefferson said this too. He talked about how America was, quote, miserably weak in the Lakota territory. So Lewis and Clark knew they needed to be careful. They knew they were at a disadvantage. Unfortunately, things turned into a really tense armed standoff because the Partisan didn't want to let the Corps of Discovery keep going. Clark lost his temper, drew his sword, and so at this point you have more than 100 Lakota people who are heavily armed. You have the 40 or so Americans who are heavily armed. Everybody's pointing guns and bows at each other. Who knows how things are going to go? The person who diffused this, though, was Black Buffalo. And I think it's really important to understand that he didn't just do this because he wanted to avoid bloodshed, although that was certainly part of it. He did it because he wanted to create an alliance with the Americans. He had a different vision for what the Lakota people needed than the partisan did. And so the key to understanding the Lakota and their view of the expedition isn't necessarily the Lakota versus Lewis and Clark. It's understanding the internal dynamics of the Lakota and how the partisan wanted more violence and sort of intimidation. Black Buffalo wanted more trade and negotiation. And Black Buffalo was able to use these outsiders, Lewis and Clark, to sort of steer his nation towards his vision of the future.
We need to take another break. I'm talking with historian Craig Fehrman. He's the author of the new book, This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. He'll be talking about the book tomorrow night at 7 at St. Louis County Library's Clark Family Branch. And when we come back, we'll talk about Sacagawea and contact with other Native nations, and you can give us a call as well. Do you have questions about Lewis and Clark's expedition? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Hi, I'm Laura Hamden, and my colleague Jessica Rogan and I are your daily hosts of the Gateway newsletter. We meet with the editors in the STLPR newsroom every weekday to bring you the top local stories of the day in a quick and easy 6-minute read by 6 a.m. In an age of overwhelm, it's a refreshing, thoughtful take on the news day, if we do say so ourselves. Fine-tune your daily news habit with the Gateway newsletter. Subscribe at stlpr.org/gateway.
Welcome back. I'm Alex Hoyer, in today for Elaine Cha. I'm talking this hour with Craig Fehrman, the author of the new book, This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. And I promised that we'd talk about Sacagawea, but I want to go to the phone lines. We have Guy calling from St. Louis. Guy, welcome to St. Louis on the Air. What's on your mind?
How you doing?
I'm all right. Go ahead, please.
Well, congratulations, first of all, on the book. That's not not easy to do. Writing and then getting something published is really hard to do, and so I'm in awe of that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the river. My wife and I have followed most of the Lewis and Clark Trail all the way up the river, far up into Montana, but every big river has what is called an eddy line, and an eddy, if you've ever been in one, you never forget it. We were on a canoe a couple of years ago down in the Mississippi around Helena, Arkansas, and we followed an eddy line for about 1.5 miles upriver and didn't paddle at all. And in an eddy, the current is going in the wrong direction. And this happens because of hydrodynamics. And any good, even the pilots today, the good towboat pilots understand the eddy line.
Guy, let me jump in here. Well, what motivated you to want to follow Lewis and Clark's their entire trail?
Well, my wife is a reporter, Pamela Selbert. And we've worked for about 35 years. We're freelancers, but we've done a great deal for the Post and for other newspapers and magazines. And we actually did stories on the Lewis and Clark Trail.
And Guy, did you have a question for Craig?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that thing about the eddy line. The good keelboat pilot knew how to keep the boat in the eddy line. You could.
All right. Well, let's get an
stay.
answer from Craig. Craig.
Sure. I really appreciate your comment there, and again, another example of how much this story resonates with people. And everything you say is right on. The nice thing for Lewis and Clark is that they had a great pilot. They had a guy named Pierre Cruzat who only had one eye, but even with one eye, he had such a strong knowledge of the Missouri from having worked so many years as a trader that he was often in the front of that barge, and so he was the one looking for eddy lines and sort of guiding them to steer toward it. Of course, the downside to eddy lines is that when you're zigzagging to find them, that makes going 1 mile in the river sometimes sometimes feel like 2 miles because you're having to do so much work to find them and locate them. So even that solution, while it's a lot easier to move the boat, does add to the travel time. It just shows how much work they had to do, but they were very fortunate to have Cruzat as somebody who could help them spot those things. And Clark and Lewis both credited him in the journal several times for his ability to do exactly what you describe.
Thanks for the call, Guy. Okay, I promised we'd talk about Sacagawea, and we can't talk about Lewis and Clark and not talk about her. But if I think back to my grade school education, when I was first introduced to her, I came to know her as a helpful guide. And I didn't learn until much later that she had been enslaved, not by Lewis and Clark, but by somebody who came on the expedition. Does that match with your earliest school memories of her?
Yeah, I think Sacagawea is somebody who's as much myth as human being at this point. One of the things that's great about her, though, is that she lives up to the myth. As a human being, she was able to do all the things that we talk about, like being the tour guide.
Yeah, but tell us what she did.
Yeah, well, it was really important for me in the book to sort of put the human being front and center. And this goes for everybody. I really tried to write a book that would put you in the canoe. But with Sacagawea's experience in particular, before Lewis and Clark showed up, she had a really, really difficult life. And this is not us projecting some kind of modern interpretation or an academic interpretation. William Clark used the word slave when he described her. So she was kidnapped from her people, the Shoshone, close to the Rocky Mountains, taken hundreds of miles to these Mandan and Hidatsa towns, where she was enslaved by native people first and then by Charbonneau. And the school version, Charbonneau is her husband. He's a fur trader. But I just really don't think that's the right word, because we know, and again, Sacagawea is 14, 15, 16 during this time period. We know that he beat her. We know that he abused her. We know that he impregnated her. So she really had a dark few years there. But I think that makes what she was able to do next only more inspiring. Because when she was a guide, she was helping Lewis and Clark out, and she was a friendly, helpful person. There's no question about that. But she was also a strategic person. She realized that by being that helpful guide, or by finding plants, or by being a good translator for them, she was making herself indispensable to Lewis and Clark. She had seen that Lewis and Clark were kind to Native people and kind to Native women. And so the more that she could sort of win their favor, the more they could protect her. And they did, in fact, protect her. At one point during the expedition, Charbonneau tried to beat her, and Clark stopped him and said, "We don't do that here." So that's a wonderful move by Clark, but to me, the story starts with Sacagawea, with her realizing, sort of like York, that even though she's in very difficult circumstances, she can make choices, she can act for herself. And so every time she was doing one of those friendly things we learned about in grade school, she was also protecting herself and her newborn son and getting herself that much closer to making it home back to her people.
Yeah, with what you've said about her being indispensable, being a helpful guide, and being a mother, I mean, mothers are amazing anyway, but right. To have on this expedition, to have a baby is just remarkable to me. Maybe my favorite part of the book was when you recounted the experience of when she helped lead the expedition in a sort of reunification with the Shoshone. Tell us about that part of the book.
Yeah, it's amazing from her perspective, because she had been hundreds of miles away. They slowly make it back. They're worried that they're not going to run into the Shoshone, and Lewis and Clark are worried because they need horses. They've started to realize that this water route Jefferson had envisioned isn't going to pan out, so they needed horses to get through the Rocky Mountains to be able to make it to the Pacific Ocean. So they're worried about the Shoshone and their horses, but Sacagawea is worried about the Shoshone because these are her people. And when they finally find the Shoshone, she turns to Clark and uses sign language, which is often how people communicated in this time period, to sort of convey, these are my kin, these are my people. So the Shoshone people, who are kind of in the front line, they take her back. And then she realizes, these just aren't the Shoshone. This is my tribe led by my brother. And this was just such an overwhelming moment for her. In the journals, Lewis says, Sacagawea seems happy all the time. As long as she has enough to eat and maybe some jewelry, nothing seems to bother her. But that's what Lewis saw. It's clear that that's not what she felt, because when she found her brother, she began to cry. And I'm not talking a couple cinematic tears rolling down a cheek. She was crying so hard and so repeatedly that she couldn't do her job as a translator. She was overwhelmed. And I think that's a clue to how much emotion she felt. And why wouldn't she? Like, we've just talked about all the stuff that she had to overcome. She made it back to her people. Her people got to meet her son. And I can't imagine what that would feel like for her to be able to hear her language spoken aloud by a large group of people, men and women, an experience she hadn't had in so long. That just had to be overwhelming to her, and it's amazing that she was able to accomplish this.
Sacagawea is with the expedition toward the end of it, and we have Diane calling from Kirkwood who wants to talk about part of the area near current-day Idaho and close to the Pacific. Diane, go ahead.
Yeah, my husband and I also took the trip that followed the path of Lewis and Clark all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. But when we were in Idaho hiking along the area they were there, we were told that they almost starved to death there, that they kind of got trapped up there. Is that true? And what's the story on that?
Sure.
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And it's absolutely true. They were in the mountains. They got very hungry, and they actually had to start killing some. They've traded for those Shoshone horses. The men ended up killing some of those horses and eating them because they needed that for sustenance. But this was a chapter that I wrote from Sacagawea's point of view when I was talking about the Rockies. And what's interesting is that the Shoshone have a very strong taboo against eating horse flesh. So even though this was a time where I don't think anybody was thrilled to eat horse flesh, but when you're hungry and when you're starving, you need to, that wasn't available to Sacagawea. And let's remember, she's breastfeeding an infant at this time, so she needs more calories than anybody. So during those Rocky Mountains, they were very hungry. They were climbing huge mountains. They were really struggling. I don't think anybody struggled more than Sacagawea, though, because the horse flesh wasn't an option for her. What she had to do was rely on this portable soup that Lewis had brought from the East Coast, and then, of course, to forage for herself.
Thanks for the call, Diane. We got an email from Stu, and Stu wants to know, when they came to river junctions, such as the Snake or the Marias or the Yellowstone, by what criteria did Lewis and Clark determine which direction they'd go? You write about this in the book.
Yeah, the Marias River is one of the most... It's one of the key instances, I think, in the entire expedition, and it connects to the experiment we were talking about. Because at this point, the Marias, which was not the right way for them to go, it's the one that looked like the river they had been on, like the Missouri. So Lewis and Clark pulled the men, as they often did, and most of the men wanted to keep going on the Marias. Lewis and Clark thought, well, we actually think the other way is the best way, and Lewis and Clark were right. But instead of just forcing this decision, they made several strategic choices about sending out small scout parties and sending scout parties ahead. They made the right decision, but they also were always managing not just geography, but morale and keeping the men happy. So it was just another example of their really excellent leadership, but also an example of how hard this was, because, they talked to Native people, and Native people would say, a river is going to branch off here, or this is the river you need to go. But that information wasn't always reliable. And in the end, Lewis and Clark had to make those calls for themselves.
One of Lewis and Clark's objectives had been to find a navigable water passage from the continental U.S. to the Pacific Ocean. Spoiler alert, they don't succeed because it doesn't exist. How big of a disappointment was that for them?
I think it was a disappointment. I mean, it's easy to be rational and say, well, you can't discover something that doesn't exist. But this was a river expedition. That's the reason they were in the Missouri working so hard, looking for the eddies, was because the point was to find the river route. The river was a superhighway in this time period. So for the commerce, for the things Jefferson wanted, they really needed the river route to work out. It did not work out, and they were frustrated. And one way I think you can see this is on the way back. That's when they really started to split up into different directions. And Lewis ended up going way off with a very small party and running into some Blackfoot people. It ended up being a very bloody encounter that at least one Blackfoot person died in. And I think the reason Lewis went on this kind of side mission, even though Jefferson was very explicit, don't do this kind of thing, is because Lewis had realized at this point on the way back, we don't have that water route that Jefferson needs. Maybe we can offer him something else. But what ended up happening was a violent encounter.
Well, they do reach the Pacific Ocean, and then they will return to St. Louis. And in our final few minutes, I want to close the loop on some of the central characters we've talked about. What happens with Lewis and Clark?
Well, they go back to Washington, D.C. They get a hero's welcome. There's a lot of attention. York's there, too. John Ordway's there, too. A lot of the people get to go back to Washington, D.C. And then they both end up back here in St. Louis. Clark has an important role in the military and also as sort of America's top diplomat with Native people. And Lewis is actually the governor of the Louisiana Territory. But something changed for Lewis on this expedition. I don't think there's any question about that. And one of the most exciting new documents I was able to find was a letter from John Quincy Adams, who met Lewis in Washington, D.C. when he'd made it back. And Lewis had only been gone for a couple years. But John Quincy Adams in this letter says, I didn't even recognize this guy. I used to have dinner with this guy at the White House, but he looks 15 years older. So to have somebody like Adams, who's such a good observer, there to report back, we can see the toll the expedition took on Lewis. Lewis had some mental health problems as well. He struggled with addiction, and so he ended up killing himself just a couple years after the expedition, which is it's a tragedy. But, when you read the journals, you can see that Lewis understood the kind of darker side of his personality, and I think it's important to say that he worked to stand up to it. He would see, even during the expedition, I'm focusing too much on the negative. I need to look forward and look on the positive. So, although he struggled with these things his entire life, he also worked hard to keep going, and I find that really heroic about him.
And in about a minute or so, what happens with York and what happens with Sacagawea? I know, a big question for a minute.
Sure. The Sacagawea one is really tricky, but Clark was in St. Louis. Clark thought that she died, but there are lots of native traditions that suggest she might have lived a long life, and I think that those traditions might be right. York asked for his freedom. He thought, I think correctly, that he had earned it given all the things that he had sacrificed, but Clark decided that he had not earned it, and so Clark kept him enslaved for more than a decade, and the end of York's life was really tragic.
Just demonstrated by the interest in this show, the callers, the emailers, people continue to be fascinated by Lewis and Clark. Fortunate for you, you've written a book on the topic, but why do you think people remain fascinated?
I think it's our country's epic. It's a big road trip. It's a big story. So much of the things that are great about America are built into the story: the confidence, the swagger, the determination. Some of the things about our country that are not so great are built into this story too, but that just makes it a complicated story. That makes it a human story, and I think the human beings are why people care so much about this.
Craig Fehrman is the author of the new book, This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. He'll be talking about the book tomorrow night at 7 at St. Louis County Library's Clark Family Branch. He'll be in conversation with WashU history professor Peter Castor. Craig, thanks so much for being on St. Louis on the Air today.
Hey, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks to the callers, too.
Today's episode was produced by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.